Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that we are carrying a series on history of English literature. So far we have conducted 17th lecture in the series, and today it would be going to be 18th lecture. Today we would be discussing on the Victorian poets. In the first half we would be discussing on Tennyson and Browning, whereas in the second half we would be discussing on Arnold. And for this very discussion we have once again within our studios Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya is a renowned academician who has students both in India and abroad. He is the author of book New History of English Literature. He has been formerly Vice Chancellor of Kurukshetra University. So dear friends, let's take advantages from his experiences and let's try to understand more and more about the Victorian poets. So I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. Hello sir, welcome to the EDCET lecture.
Thank you. Well, in this lecture today we shall discuss the Victorian poets, the major ones, and in the first generation, the major poets of the Victorian age are Alfred Tennyson and Robert Browning, both born in the beginning of the century. Like Tennyson was born in 1809 and Browning in 1812. And Tennyson, of course, lived almost until the end of the century. Browning died a little earlier. Now, between these two major poets, the Victorian poetry expresses itself in two very different colors. Whereas Tennyson was more conservative, more given to looking to the past, and hung up with myths and legends. So obviously there is a lot of nostalgia in his poetry. Nostalgia for what was and is no longer there. So this sad note in Victorian poetry, it is a key to the poetry. It is central. And it runs through the entire lot, not merely Tennyson, Browning too, later Arnold also. All the major poets reflect the mood of the time. The reason for this mood of almost despondence, a mood which was sad and overburdened with something preciously lost, and something lost forever, something precious and at the same time lost forever. So it is this mood which is reflected in the poetry of Tennyson and Browning, two different faces of course. Now behind all this, we have talked earlier also about it, but just to recap, in the Romantic age, early 19th century, we had a lot of radicalism, enthusiasm, and we had the spirit of the French Revolution. So ideas of equality, freedom, democracy, so on and so forth. But then in the later 19th century, which is 1837, because Romantic age was 1798 to 1837. Now Victorian age is between 1837 and 1895, end of the century. That is the period of the Victorian age. Now, during this age, some very important things have happened. One was in 1837, the first Reform Bill, and in the second, 1865, second Reform Bill. So both the Reform Bills came up during this period of the Victorian age. Now these two bills changed the entire scenario of the Victorian society. 1837 gave voting right to the common people. 1865 to the workers also. So the working class, the lowermost sections of society, they were given the voting right in the process of democracy. So democracy extending to the grassroots. But here one thing is important. Even until 1865, no voting right to women. Even workers got it, but not women, even of the highest class. They had no voting right. And it took another 50 years to obtain that. Women had to struggle. They had to go even to prisons. They had to agitate, and very militantly at times. So finally it was in 1922, after World War I, that women got the voting right. But male workers had got it in 1865. So this was the one important thing that happened during the Victorian age. Now the second was Darwin, Charles Darwin. He gave his theory of evolution, which was shocking to the common people, particularly those who were committed to Christianity and to religion overall. Shock was that Darwin said there is nothing special about man, because Christianity would say man was the special creation of God, and God created man in his own image. Means man is God-like, has God-like qualities. But then there came a shock in the mid-century when Darwin said it is all the evolution of animal species, and man has evolved himself from the monkey. The earlier form of man is monkey. Now that was quite a shock, because all those noble ideas, great ideas about gods, goddesses, and man being a descendant of the gods, now that was gone, and there came this shock. So the Victorians had to contend with all this. Now how do you take it? So there came about what is popularly called the Victorian Compromise. The Victorians were not radical like the Romantics. They were not out to follow their own inspiration, their own dream, even at the cost of losing the society. and becoming an exile like Byron, Shelley, Keats. They did. They even left England. They left their own society and became exiles in Italy. But the Victorians were not radical in that sense. They were not ready to sacrifice everything for the sake of one thing. So, their mood was of acceptance. Whatever comes, accept it. So, they had to compromise between Darwin and Christ. On the one hand, the Christian religion giving you all sorts of ideas about how Christ sacrificed and how we are children of God and so on. On the other, that we are an improved form of the monkeys. So, between these two, the Victorians had to strike a compromise, and therefore they accepted the fallibility of man, that man is not God-like. Man has all the susceptibilities and fallibilities that animals have, the same desires, those very weaknesses. So Victorians had to strike a compromise between those noble ideas of Christianity and the hard facts of scientists like Charles Darwin, then T.H. Huxley and others. There were several. So this is called compromise between science and religion, between the lofty ideals of religion and the hard, unpalatable facts of life, of evolution. Because those ideas were based upon experiments, and experiments where scientists had devoted their lifetime doing nothing else. With that dedication, they had come out with proven facts about human life. So the Victorians had no choice but to accept that also. But at the same time, they did not want to reject outright their inherited, religion, Christianity, its values of what is to be done and what is not to be done, what is good and what is not good. So here comes what we call Victorian compromise. That is why when it comes to the leading Victorian poets, we find that they are seeking escape. They are not really confronting the issues. The problems of staring them in the face, that they are trying to escape and find solace elsewhere, because this was too harsh to digest, unpalatable, and therefore you have in Tennyson, Lady of Shalott, for example, a long poem, 10,000 lines of narrative, and what is she doing all the time in those 10,000 lines? She just looks into the mirror and sees there reflections of life. This is significant. So, trying to seek compensation in something which is not real, something which is a mere reflection of reality. Because reality is too harsh to face and to live through. Therefore, make do with an image of it. So, Lady of Shalott always looking into the mirror and reflections of life rather than leading life as such. So, it was this kind of situation and this kind of response to that situation in the Victorian age. So, Tennyson would serve us in the name of poetry these myths and legends sorry, rather than the contemporary life around him. So, that is being ignored, that is being overlooked, and he is looking beyond elsewhere. So, that is what the Victorian poets did. Even as Ulysses, for example, in Ulysses, he is singing in praise of the old Greek hero. There he is called Odyssey, but through translations from Greek to Roman to French to German and then finally English, it becomes Ulysses. So, Tennyson's poem Ulysses, it glorifies the spirit of Ulysses, which is that we will go on marching, we will not stop, and we will go on exploring life to the end. The phrase he uses is drinking life to the lees, to the last drop. It was that spirit of living full-blooded life that we find in a poem like Ulysses. But the reality is very different, just the opposite of it, which means the Victorians are seeking satisfaction and solace elsewhere because it is not there in their real life. So, they look beyond the real. So, all of these poems, it may be Ulysses, it may be Lady of Shalott, we find that the poets overlook the realities of their own time and look beyond into the legends, myths, just to feel at home, just to, you see, digest the unpalatable, the harsh realities of their own time. So, this is what we have in Tennyson. As for Browning, he is a different kind of poet, not hung up so much with myths and legends as with the theme of love as such, talking straight about the theme of love. But then, what kind of love? It is not the love that flourishes. It is not the love of consummation. It is the love which is lost, which you cannot regain. That is why in the poetry of Robert Browning, we have such situations where the lovers have lost their life of love, and now only can look back with nostalgia or with a sense of loss. As against Tennyson's Ulysses or Lady of Shalott or In Memoriam or Idylls of the King, we have Browning poems like Pippa Passes. This is an interesting poem. Pippa is a girl. She goes for work every morning. But as she is going, she is singing. What she sings is important. She has a certain faith, positive, but she is pitted against her faith and her joy, against the surrounding scenes of doubt and sorrow. So, contrasting the realities of the age and dreams and aspirations of the individual. Here is a girl who is young, who looks into future with hopes and aspirations and has certain dreams about it. Therefore, when she goes for work in the morning, she is singing those songs of aspirations, songs full of hope and joy and fun. But then, what the poet is doing? Poet is situating that dream and aspiration, expectation of this girl in the grim reality of the age, which is just the opposite, where no such thing can grow, where no such thing can flourish, because the soil is not the one where anything can grow or can be allowed to grow. So, contrasting the individual hopes and aspirations and the harsh realities of the age, because here is an age where it is not merely the disillusionment created by the new ideas of the evolutionists. There is also a stronger force of disenchantment, which is industry. So, industry during the Victorian age had become predominant, because earlier during the Romantic period or early 19th century, the life in England was by and large agrarian. Not only England, the entire Europe or the West. Agrarian, where agriculture is at the center of your life, is the main source of sustenance. So, the change came about, and Thank you very much. We stop here and take a well, to give last touches to Browning that we were discussing. One of the important poems of Browning, we cannot leave without mentioning, is The Last Ride Together. So, the last ride of the lovers together. And in the poem, the speaker is recalling this last ride with nostalgia. Obviously, something which was there but no longer remains. So, it is that sense of loss that we have in the Victorian poetry in different forms, in different poets. In Tennyson, we had it through a look back at legends and myths which supposedly were there once but are no longer there. In Browning, more realistic situations, closer to home, closer to our own day-to-day experience. And that is why a poem like The Last Ride Together, where there is a pair of lovers and they recall the last ride they had, ride of joy, ride of union, ride of togetherness, ride of consummation of love. Now all that is gone, and you can only look back to it with a sense of loss, with a sense of what was once there but is no longer there. So that is the key to the Victorian temper, the Victorian mood, the Victorian reality. At the core of the Victorian life, it is this thorn which is in their flesh. The thorn is the unpalatable ideas of the scientists and then realities of industry. So science and industry piercing like a thorn into the flesh of the age, and how to take it. No choice. Therefore, painful or whatever, you have to take it. Hence, the mood of compromise in the Victorian age. So, it is reflected in their own different ways, both in Tennyson and Browning. Now, after this first generation of poets comes the second. Matthew Arnold comes after these two. And in Matthew Arnold, you find the sense of loss becoming more agonizing. In Browning and Tennyson, it only appears as a form of looking back with nostalgia. But now in Arnold, it is not just looking back. It is not mere nostalgia. It is an agony. It is an agonizing experience that you have to live without it. So that is why you have a poem like The Last Ride Together. That was Browning. But in Arnold, Dover Beach. In Dover Beach, I may give you just a few lines to give you an idea what Arnold is doing in his poetry as a whole, because Dover Beach is a representative poem. These lines are: the sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furls. But now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. So look at it, how sad, how painful. Somebody sitting at the shore, looking into the sea and comparing what the sea was like and what the sea is like today. So what was once full of faith, it is symbolic, and you had the sea full of storms, full of life, waves coming, sweeping everything, and then retreating. But now it is in a stage of retreat where no waves come rushing onto the shore, no longer. They are withdrawn. And the poet sitting there, he only hears the withdrawing sound, the sad note of the withdrawal of the waves. Otherwise, there used to be roaring sound of the rising waves of the sea. But now there is no rise, there is only fall. There is no rushing in, there is only withdrawal. So this is what we have in Dover Beach. Matthew Arnold is in a way talking of the same thing that Tennyson and Browning did, the sense of loss in the Victorian age. But then they were of the generation where acceptance was the predominant mood, compromise, accept whatever comes to your fortune, to your fate, to your destiny. But now Arnold, although accepting, not reacting or rejecting or rebelling against as the Romantics did, but at the same time accepting the same thing with more agonizing tone, in a more agonizing tone. Is accepting all right, but it is much more painful than it ever was. So if you compare the poems on the same theme, on the one hand by Tennyson and Browning, and on the other by Matthew Arnold, you find the same sense of loss which we had in the earlier generation, senior poets of the age, now has become a more acute sense of realization, and hence more painful, more agonizing. So that is the difference between the first generation Victorian poets and the second generation, which is best represented by Dover Beach, or by Matthew Arnold. Now another thing, in the first generation, Tennyson and Browning expressed themselves in poetry. But now that medium is being found inadequate. Inadequate for the kind of ideas they have to contend with and the kind of experience that they have to go through. Now that has become so complex and intense that it is not possible to express it in simple narratives like Tennyson could do, or in simple life situations as Browning could do, because now it is much more complex. So what do you have? You have in Arnold a poetry of the mind. You have the poetry of thought. You have the poetry where no experience, no event, no happening of life is being described or narrated. Here are pure thoughts contending with each other, and the poet caught up in that tangle of ideas and trying to resolve thread by thread the knots of ideas, the tangles. That is why, better than Arnold's poems, we get to understand those very ideas in his prose writings. His two series of essays that he wrote. Now, those two series explain his case much better than do his poems. And those essays we know were called essays in criticism. The first series came out in 1865, the second in 1889. Now, interestingly, the main essay in the first series is Study of Poetry. And there Arnold defines poetry as criticism of life. Now, this definition of poetry was never there before. It may have been intimately related to life. It may give you reflections of life, like in Tennyson's Lady of Shalott, or in Browning's The Last Ride Together. We get pictures of life narrated or dramatized. In Browning we have dramatization. In Tennyson we have narratives. That is why Browning is credited with a new form of poetry, which is called dramatic monologue. It is not somebody describing something or somebody narrating something, somebody telling you the story. No. Here there is monologue, there is a speaker, speaks, but speaks as if on the stage, speaks as if a dramatic part in a play. It is monologue, it is not a dialogue. There is only one character, but then giving a dramatic performance of his own role or her own role. So through that dramatic speech, Browning evolved this new form of poetry called dramatic monologue. We had something similar in the 17th century, the metaphysical poets. But even there, the full form of dramatic monologue was not there. In metaphysical poetry, the characters do speak, they do perform. But then they are more hung up with their metaphysics, not with life as such as with ideas. So the level of engagement of the poet's mind is different in two cases. With the metaphysicals, it is the higher level, philosophic and more contemplative kind of poetry. Here, in the case of Browning, it is more performative, more dramatic, not philosophic or contemplative. That is why it becomes dramatic monologue. And Browning is credited with this, no other poet. So he was the first and the greatest exponent of this form of poetry called dramatic monologue. As for Arnold, as I said, he did not really continued with either the practice of Tennyson or the practice of Browning. He discarded both their forms, both their poetic manners of expression, and rightly, because his theme was much more complex, much more difficult, much more tangled, because he comes at a stage when the issues of the Victorian age are just like the horns locked up, and therefore the poet is caught up in that difficult situation where it is not easy to thresh out the tangled ideas. So Matthew Arnold has that difficult task to perform. That is why his poetry is not really so much poetry as it is prose. That is why he has to redefine poetry. For the first time we hear that poetry is criticism of life, although it has always been. But we never use the word criticism. We used to say it is reflection of life, it is representation of life, it is, as Hamlet says, holding mirror up to nature. So all forms of representation of life, but never criticism. Criticism was meant only to be done in the medium of prose. That is why right from the 18th century you have essays, critical essays, and even before that critical treatises, theoretical, just as Aristotle's Poetics, over 2000 years old. That was there. But poem as such was kept as a poem. It was never made a medium for criticism of life. But Arnold defines poetry as criticism of life. So its theme is criticism of life, to give a critique of life as such. So poetry now becomes more critical. It is criticism which has entered into the body of poetry. It's no longer a song or a lyric or a story or a tale, a narrative. All you have is criticism of life. Well, I think enough for the day. Thank you. Stop here, because your coming is an indication.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very productive session on Victorian poets. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that in the future sessions that tomorrow we would be discussing on Victorian prose, and later on we would be discussing on Victorian criticism, as we have some few minutes left over here. So tomorrow we will be discussing on the prose. Victorian prose.
And then criticism.
So what are we going to discuss in tomorrow's lecture?
Prose writers.
Prose writers such as?
Such as there were so many.
Such as there are so many that we would be going to discuss tomorrow. Dear friends, we would like to tell you all that if you want to access our lectures, then these lectures on history of English literature are there for you on YouTube. You can access these lectures, you can see the lectures number of times you want it, and afterwards if you feel that you have any queries, or if you have any kind of suggestion which you would like to give to us, then you can mail us at info.cec@nic.in. We would love to solve your queries the next time when Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya visits our studio. So as I already said, the lectures are there for you on YouTube, and this lecture also we are going to upload for you on YouTube. These lectures are basically for your easy accessibility, as well as to increase the frequency, that is the number of times you wanted to see these lectures. So we would be meeting again tomorrow and would be discussing on Victorian prose. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.